Fridays wouldn't be as good or as nice if we didn't have all the Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So here we are again, we kind of reached another little goal or milestone. What I'd like to do first today is I'd like to address the homework. So if you would, take out that handout that I gave you. It's called Review Worksheet 1. If you don't have that out already, take it out. And I wanted to give you one, I don't want to say hint or comment about something, and then I'll go ahead and ask if there are any questions on this assignment, because I do want to collect this for a grade today. And I guess my hint or my comment is in the middle section, the tonicization, where you have to analyze 4 stabs from well, it's not really a string quartet, but it's like from a string ensemble. And you see how you have that alto clef there in the 3rd stab. You guys remember how to read alto clef? Okay. Well, what I wanted to tell you is that that passage does not modulate. So I hope you didn't put in a pivot chord and try to shift key or change key to go from G minor to some other key. It does not modulate. You should be able to analyze every chord there in G minor, which is going to require then, it looks like a couple. I have 2 secondary chords. 2 secondary chords in that passage. But you should still be able to analyze it all in G minor. And it does not modulate. I don't know if any of you thought it might, or if you were tempted to think it might, or if some of you tried to force it or tried to create modulation there when there wasn't one. But I wanted to kind of stem that thought process, or cut that thought process off right away, because it should be all analyzed in G minor. Okay, now, let me ask if there are any questions about something on this. Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Can I ask about the 2nd chord in the middle part and also the 6th chord?
Okay. So the 2nd chord, let me just, yeah, maybe I can go ahead and at least write the notes up here, even though I don't have 4 stabs. It looks like I've got an F sharp in the bass, and the alto, it looks like it happens to have an A. Yeah. And then there's a C in the 2nd violins, and there is an E flat in the 1st violins. And I don't have to put a stem on it, I guess, but I could. Okay, so the 2nd chord, those are the notes that I get. I'm in the key of G minor. So if I look at it, I have, it's in root position. It's an FACE chord. Specifically, the root is F sharp, and I've got an E flat in there. So I know it's a 7th chord, because there's 4 different tones. And if I were to play it on the piano, it will sound diminished, and it is. It's actually a fully diminished 7th chord, because F sharp to A is a minor 3rd, A to C is a minor 3rd, and C to E flat is a minor 3rd. It's all stacked minor 3rds. Okay? So now, just because this has, let's see here. Yeah. Just because this has an F sharp accidental, does that mean it's a chromatic chord in the key of G minor? No, it doesn't, because F sharp is G minor's leading tone. So this is actually a diatonic chord. It's a chord that fits in the key. Okay, and the root is the 7th scale degree, so I would just label this chord as one of these. 7 fully diminished 7. I don't think you have to make it more complicated or any harder than that, because that's what we got there.
If think I was trying to make it a secondary dominant.
Yeah, see, I mean, I understand, especially if you see an accidental, but remember, F sharp does kind of sort of belong to G minor, so it's not really considered a chromatic pitch.
Yeah.
So it's a regular diatonic chord. And then you had asked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth chord.
Yeah.
Okay. That one does have a chromatic pitch. In fact, there it is in the bass. It's a B natural. B natural has no place in G minor. Okay. Not in natural minor, not in harmonic minor, not in melodic minor. Okay, so that's definitely chromatic pitch. And then we have a G, and looks like we have another G, and then we have a D. Okay? So, it looks like it is a G, B, D chord. G, B natural D. Now, can I call that a capital 1 in G minor? No, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay? So because it's got a chromatic pitch, I have to think of it as a secondary chord. Is it a diminished chord or is it a major chord? G, B, D. It's a major chord, right? So it can't be a secondary leading tone, because those are always diminished in type and quality. But it can be a secondary dominant, because dominants are major. So I could actually call it a 5, it looks like it's in first inversion, a 5/6 of something. And if G is the root of this chord, G is the dominant of, or a fifth above, C. What Roman numeral is C, in the key of G minor? 4, that's right. So I would say it's a 5/6 of a minor 4. Because 4s are minor in minor keys. Yeah, that's how I would analyze that or explain that chord. And then I think there was one other secondary chord. It looks like it's the fourth one. I hope you got a secondary chord here. Because it's also got a B natural in it. I have to check.
Could you please do an E minor for the part 1?
Yeah. So that's the third spelling example?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Mhm. This quickly. Looks like we're in a treble clef. Let me just make some space here. And we're supposed to spell a 7, fully diminished 7 of 5 in E minor. Okay, good. This goes back to the basics of how you read this symbol. If we're in E minor, what is the root of a 5 chord in E minor? B, right? Now, doesn't matter what note you need to make it. Just think, what accidentals you might have to use. What note is B's leading tone? That is, what note is a minor second below B? What do you get? A sharp, yeah, that's right. Good. So that's half the battle right there. You got to calculate the root correctly. Otherwise, the whole chord will be wrong. It looks like it's asking for a root position. 7th chord on A sharp. So I can put A sharp on the bottom. And to spell a fully diminished 7th chord, I just need to stack up minor third intervals. So a minor third above A sharp actually is C sharp, and I need an accidental for that one. C sharp up a minor third will give us E. That doesn't need an accidental. And E up a minor third will give us G. And that doesn't need an accidental. So it looks like the proper way, the correct spelling of this chord is, first of all, the root is A sharp. That's the leading tone to B. And then I spell the fully diminished 7th chord on A sharp, which is A sharp, C sharp, E, G. Yeah,
Could we also do the fifth chord on the last section?
the last example,
Yes.
let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does this, Hannah, does this get to your, did that help you?
Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully, like if I'm doing this up here and you were confused before, hopefully you can see either where you went wrong or what you didn't think about, or what you were overlooking or something like that, so that you can see how to do it in the future. All right, so I'm gonna do the fifth chord in the Schumann example. Yeah, okay. And it looks like, once again, we have, what is it with these markers? Well, I'll use this one until it dies completely, I guess. So we have a B natural in the bass, we have a G in the tenor, and we have a D shared between the alto and the soprano. So once again, it's just a major triad, G, D. This time, however, we're in the key of F major. Does B natural belong in F major at all? No. No way can you force B natural in F major. So that means I'm looking at a chromatic chord, and we only know two types. We know the secondary dominant, and we know the secondary leading tone. Which one of those two is it going to be based on its quality? The secondary what?
Very dominant.
Dominant, yeah, because it's a major triad. It's not diminished. All right, so that means it's going to be a 5 of something. Specifically, what inversion is this chord in?
6.
That's right, 5, 6. Now, go to the root. G is the root. We're saying that if we're calling this a secondary dominant, that means G is the dominant of what pitch? Or G is a perfect fifth above what note? Somebody said it. C, right? Okay. So we're saying G is the dominant to C. Okay, now, what Roman numeral chord does C support in this key? A 5. So in F major, we're saying this GBD chord is just a dominant of the real dominant in the key. G chord is a dominant of C. C being the primary or the main dominant in F. That's what we're saying. So I hope that irons that out. Okay, maybe I can take one more.
I had a question about non-coding code,
Yeah,
the last passage. How many were there?
I only found 3, it looks like, and they were all in the soprano voice.
Was there one already marked for us?
Yes, one is already marked for you. So there's 2 others in the soprano.
I had a question about accents for the, was it that if it becomes accented, if the beat is stronger than the one that came before or after?
After.
After.
Yeah, a non-chord tone is considered accented if the note after it is either on a weaker beat or a weaker half of the beat. Yeah, that's right. Okay, we're over 15 minutes in, so make sure your name is on this page, and I'll come around and collect this. Just because I need to do something this week. Just kidding. All right, who wants to start? Are you ready, Colson? There you go. Well, yeah, but it's a cadential 6/4. You know how 1 6/4 to 5 and together stands for 5. So it has to be, but still, yeah, I still have it for 5 6 5.
I double checked. That's printed.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, there's a map here. It doesn't say you can see what it is. All right, now, we're going to learn today how to use secondary dominance in progressions, which is going to help us learn and understand what types of chords can come before secondary dominance. We know, for instance, what types of chords come after secondary dominance. Let me use this example right here. A 5 6 of a 5 is going to go to what chord? Right? That's what we expect it to go to. So we know that. We've been dealing with that since the beginning of the semester. But besides knowing what chords secondary dominants go to, we can also learn what sorts of chords precede secondary dominance. That is, what kinds of chords come before secondary dominance. And in order to learn that, what we need to understand is that secondary dominance can be thought of as chromatically altered versions of diatonic chords that share the same root. That's a big, well, what does that even mean? Could you repeat that, Dr. Roberts? Secondary dominance can be thought of as chromatically altered versions of diatonic chords that share the same root. Make some space on here. See if I can show you what I mean. So here I'm in treble clef. Man, I'm really striking out with these months. I thought one of these ones I just got right in you. I don't want to take too much time on that. Ooh, that one looks good. At least for now. What Roman numeral is that chord in the key of C? Do you have it? Just a regular 2-chord. But notice I just finished saying that secondary dominants are chromatically altered versions of diatonic chords that share the same root. Is there a secondary dominant in the key of C that also uses the root or has the root D? And the answer is yes. That is the 5 of 5. So I'd like you to think of, or I guess what I'm trying to say is that a 5 of 5 is basically just like a diatonic 2-chord, but it's a souped up version. You could say it's a pimped out version. No, it's a 2-chord on steroids in a way. Okay? And that's because the 5 of 5 will always have the same root as a 2-chord. Okay? And we know then that both of these chords, both the 2 and the 5 of 5, they like to go to, or they will go to, a 5 chord in the key of C, won't they? Now, when viewed from this perspective, we find that secondary dominants function or behave similarly to their diatonic counterparts. And as such, they can generally be substituted in progressions for their diatonic versions. In other words, I'm trying to say, what I'm saying is that any secondary dominant that shares a root with a regular diatonic chord, those two chords can basically be used interchangeably in chord progressions. You can substitute one for the other. And a real simple example would be, for instance, like if I'm in the key of C and I write a well-formed progression that goes 1, 2, 6, 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, then because I know that the 5 of 5 has the same root as a 2 chord, well then I can also write this progression as this. Right? What I have done is I have substituted for the plainer sounding diatonic chord, I substitute a spicier sounding chord, one that's got a little more strength to it, a little more impetus, a little more oomph. But I can do that because these chords, the 2 and the 5 of 5, share the same root. And I'm basically saying that a secondary dominant, as long as it shares the same root as a diatonic chord, it's got the same function. It behaves similarly in progressions.
So that chord, the 5 of 5, it's basically just a 2 chord in C in a different mode.
It's kind of like a 2 chord in a C in a different mode, but I just kind of like to think that, rather than playing the diatonic notes where this is minor, this uses a chromatic note to always make the secondary dominant sound major.
Okay.
So I guess to me it gives it just a little more spice or flavor to the progression. I'll just play a progression up there on the board over there in a little bit to try to illustrate what I mean. But I guess I don't know. It's almost like if the 2 chord, the diatonic chord would be like regular Bruce Banner, but the 5 of 5 is like the Hulk. You know what I'm saying? They're one and the same. They function. They behave similarly. But this is the secondary dominant is always a stronger chord than the diatonic chord that it can substitute for. But they still behave similarly. And so one of the things I have over here on the board is a chart, and it might be helpful for you to copy this down into your notes. And what I've done is I've written on this top row here, I've written a circle progression. What is a circle progression? Does anyone know? I think we've talked about that before.
The music can just move. Right?
Yeah, it means that the root movement is basically following the circle of fifths. Okay? So do you see how I've set up these diatonic chords in such a way that every next chord's root is a fifth lower than the previous chord's root? So I've gone C, F, B, E, A, B, B, C. And when you do that, the diatonic chord Roman numerals turn out to be 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. We can call that a descending fifth progression. That's the way the roots move, also known as a circle progression. But do not secondary dominants also behave or function or progress the same way? Don't they always go to a chord whose root is a fifth lower? That's part of the secondary dominance definition, reason for being. So I've got the diatonic chords arranged by descending fifth root movement up here, and what I have down here in this row is the corresponding secondary dominant chord that shares the same root with the diatonic chord in the same column. So I'm saying that a 5 of 4 can act very similarly and behave similarly to a 1 chord in a progression, because they both have C they share the same root. And a 5 of 3 can be substituted for a 7 in a progression sometimes. And a 5 of 6 can be interchanged with a regular diatonic 3 chord. A 5 of 2 interchanged with 6. The 5 of 5 gets interchanged with 2. You see how I did that over there? Because they share the same root. And then these are just your standard dominant and tonic again. But you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 secondary dominants that if you wanted to in a progression, you could substitute for their diatonic counterparts and perhaps make the progression sound a little more strong, or a little more spicy, or a little more intense because of the chromatic pitches that these chords possess, that these chords do not. But you gotta always remember to exchange or substitute chords that share the same root. So let me see if I can show you an example. Do you see up here, I've got in the top row, I have a diatonic progression in B flat major. I've got 1, 6, 2, 7, 5, 7, 1. We know now that the two chord can be substituted. We can substitute a 5 of 5 for a 2 chord, right? Because they will always have the same root. Which of these secondary dominants can you substitute for a 6 chord? According to this chart, look at the columns. Yeah, 5 of 2. That's right. So I substituted a 5 of 2 for the 6 chord, and I rewrote the progression as 1, 5 of 2, 5, 7 of 5, 5, 7, and 1. And this progression, the one in the bottom row with the secondary dominants, is just as good, if not cooler sounding, perhaps, than the top progression. Substituting these two secondary dominants for those 2 diatonic chords doesn't make the progression incorrect in any way. See if I can play these 2 progressions for you so you can hear what I mean. Here's the first progression with just the diatonic chords. So that was 1, 6, 2, 7, 5, 7, 1. But now let me play the progression right below it with the secondary dominant substituted. Maybe because jazz musicians use secondary dominants a lot. Okay? So, again, the plainer sounding version, something like that. Which isn't bad, but here's the jazzier sounding one. Okay, so really I think this chart, to reference this chart, to rely on this chart is going to help you. Because again, any chord in the same column, these diatonic chords up here can be substituted by their corresponding, that's not a secondary dominant, by their corresponding secondary dominants below. Now, can anyone tell me why I don't have a secondary dominant in the key of C with a root of F to go along with the 4 chord? Well, just think. You kind of see the pattern here? 5 of 4, the next chord over here is 4. 5 of 3, 3, 5 of 6, 6, 5 of 2, 2, etc., etc. If I did a 5 of something here, what would it have to be? 5 of what? 7. Can we have a 5 of a diminished chord? No, you can never have a secondary dominant of a diminished chord. Because diminished chords can never temporarily sound like tonic. We talked about that again in the first weeks of class. So there is no secondary dominant to substitute for 4 in this case, because it would be a 5 of something that doesn't even sound like tonic. Okay. So again, think of this chart, think of the columns and refer to that as we go along here. Now, this procedure, this interchanging or substitution procedure of secondary dominants for diatonic chords, this explains why secondary dominants sometimes move directly to other secondary dominants instead of resolving normally to diatonic chords, creating what is known as a secondary dominant chain. Take a look at this example again. Isn't that, I mean, with our, with our naive eyes, doesn't it seem weird for a 5 of 2 to go to a 5 of 5? Shouldn't 5 of 2 go to 2? Well, it's kind of like it is, it's just that I've substituted something a little stronger for the 2. So there's really nothing funky or strange going on. The function and the behavior of the progression is still correct. But this explains now why you can have multiple secondary dominants in a row. You could have a 5 of 6 go to a 5 of 2, which would go to a 5 of 5, and then that would go to a 5, etc., etc. Okay? So it's not, again, it's not too abnormal or out of the ordinary. It's just that when you see secondary dominant chains, usually the following secondary dominants are just substituting for what you would expect the earlier secondary dominant to go to. And this is called a secondary dominant chain. And that is when you have more than one secondary dominant in a row. A secondary dominant chain. And there was an assignment weeks ago when we were first studying secondary dominants. There was a Mozart example on the back that you had to analyze. And I think there was, in that example, it went from a 5 of 2 to a 5 of 5 or something like that. And I just wanted to explain that a little bit to you, that that's what it is without going into all this detail. Okay. Okay. Now, based on the similarities between secondary dominants and their diatonic counterparts, we can begin to understand what sorts of chords can come before or precede secondary dominance. And let me make a little space for this. Actually, I probably could have used a similar example that I had on the board. Let's try something like this. So we got 1, 4, 5, 5, 5, and 1. And let me just take this chord out for the time being. If I want to fill a chord in here to complete or connect this progression, how do I know what kind of chord can come before a 5 of 5? Well, let's remember what we just talked about. Isn't a 5 of 5 simply like a 2 chord? Just super hulked up on steroids or something like that? So let's think of this 5 of 5 as behaving or functioning just like a 2 chord, because it has the same root. Well, what chord can come before a 2 chord? We've written progressions before. Sure. Yeah, a 4 chord would work. What's another one that could come before a 2 chord? A 6 chord would work. And what about another one? Don't think too hard.
7.
I
Or no.
don't know about 7. What about just a tonic chord? Can 1 come before 2? Yeah. And then what about this? Now that you know this, couldn't a 5 of 2 come before 2? Yeah. So look at all these possibilities that we could put in right before the 5 of 5, and they would all make logical sense. Because I'm just treating, instead of looking at, whoa, 5 of 5, that is so intimidating, I have no clue what you're... No, it's not that. Oh, that's just basically it's like a 2 chord. Think of it as a 2 chord, and then whatever you write before 2 chord, you can write before 5 of 5. Did I lose anyone there? Okay. Let me give you a handout that should hopefully kind of put step by step the choices that you can use to precede a secondary dominant with. Now let me find that. Here we go. Sorry, it's typed on the back, but on the one side it's handwritten because I needed to put some examples on there, and I didn't have enough time to put it in finale. So let's look at the side with the handwriting. Okay, a secondary dominant at the top may be preceded by, number one, a tonic chord. That's pretty nice, because when in doubt, if you don't know what to write before a secondary dominant, any secondary dominant can be preceded by a one chord. There's no laws or rules against that. All right. Now, number two, a secondary dominant may be preceded by the diatonic version of the secondary dominant. So I guess one thing we didn't talk about here is this. The 5 of 5 could actually be preceded by the 2, the chord it's substituting for itself. Why? Because this is stronger than this. And when we write progressions in music, we like to go from weaker functions to stronger functions as we get closer to the end of the progression. So, a secondary dominant can always be preceded by the diatonic version of itself. That means a 5 of 6 could be preceded by a 3 in a progression. And a 5 of 2 could be preceded by a 6 in a progression. Because this is the weaker, this is the stronger with the same function. Number 3, a secondary dominant may be preceded by a chord that would normally precede the diatonic version. That's just what we did here, right? We can precede 5 of 5 with whatever we precede a 2 with. That's all it's saying. This chord can be preceded by anything that its diatonic version can be preceded by. That's what number 3 is saying. And we came up with many possibilities. 4, 6, well, 1 was rule number 1, but things like that. I know these may sound a little confusing, but this is what they mean. Finally, number 4, a secondary dominant can be preceded by a chord that can precede the chord to be tonicized by the secondary dominant. Woof! What does that mean? Well, it means this. It means that this secondary dominant can be preceded by a chord that can precede this one. That's what it means. This is the chord being tonicized by the 5 of 5. And 4 is saying that this chord can be preceded by a chord that can precede this one. What kind of chord can come before a 5? A lot of the answers will be the same as what we just came up with. Doesn't a 4 chord come before a 5? Yeah. Well, so we're saying because 4 can come before 5, then we're saying that 4 can come before the secondary dominant of 5, which just kind of gets in between, interrupts. So those are the 4, I want to say, they're 4 guidelines to help you figure out and understand or learn what kind of chord you could write before a secondary dominant. I call them, well, I guess I call them down further below, like rule 1, 2, 3, and 4. Rule 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do you see, can you take a look at, well, since you have it in front of you, let me just play that piano. Do you see the first example where I use rule 1? You see the example that goes 1, 6, 5, 6, 5, 5, 5? That's in the key of C. I'm using rule 1, and that is I'm preceding the secondary dominant with a tonic. It sounds like this. Okay. What about the middle example there? I'm using rule 2. The diatonic version of the secondary dominant. We know 2 is the diatonic version of a 5 of 5. So it sounds like this. Which actually works pretty nicely. The third example uses rule 3. And that is we're saying whatever can precede a 2 chord can precede the 5 of 5. So I use the 6 in that case. And it sounds like this. And then I used rule 4. And I've got the explanation down at the very bottom where it says, because 4 can precede 5, 4 can also precede 5 of 5. Because 5 is the one that's being tonicized. And so that one sounds like this. All right, the final thing we need to do is just kind of apply this. Part of the assignment that I've got for you for Monday is going to be to just decide one chord that can come before a secondary dominant and then part write those chords together, connect them with part write. Okay, so I've got an example up on the board which I started writing before class and I didn't quite finish, but that's okay. I'll show you exactly what I mean. I'm going to be in G major here. Fill in a few blanks. This comes out of the workbook. All right, now, and then I gotta get a blank here. I need someone to help me analyze this chord, the given chord, in the key of G. Notice it's a chromatic chord. It's E, G sharp, B, and D. What would the correct Roman numeral be for this chord? Okay, E is the root. And we're saying, and by the way, this is a major minor 7 or a dominant 7. So we're going to say that if with E the root, it's 5 of something. E is the 5th of what?
5 of 2.
5 of 2, that's right. E is the 5th of A. And A is 2 in this key. So, but let's get it more specific. What inversion is that chord in? Third inversion, that's right. So it's 5, 4, 2 of 2. Okay. Now, is it strange that a 5 of 2 is going to a 5 of 5? No, not really. Because 5 of 5 is just a stronger version of 2. Okay. So, part of what we're going to have to do in the homework is to part write or resolve this chord to this chord. But the main thing is, what kind of chord can I put here to come before a 5 of 2? Okay, go look at your handout. You use rules either 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which one do you want to use? The first one? Okay, let's use tonic. That's perfectly fine. Now, what am I in? I'm in the key of G. Now, usually, do I have that? Yeah, I do have it written on there. Look at your handout. It says, when part writing, the chord preceding the secondary dominant should be voiced so that it leads smoothly into the secondary dominant. In other words, small leaps or steps. If I part write the chord like this, with this in the bass, I know the bass can jump a 5th, but is there a smoother way to hit the bass? Can I choose a different inversion?
1/6.
Okay, a 1/6. Now you might say, but can't you use 1/6/4, Dr. Robinson? No. 1/6/4 is off limits. That's that special cadential 6/4 chord. Don't ever use 1/6/4. In fact, don't use any triads in 6/4 inversion for these. So the closest I'm going to be able to get the bass is right here. I'm going to part write a 1/6. All right. I need a G. Where's a good voice to put a G in? The soprano, yeah, that's right. Because now the sopranos can just move up a half step. Okay. I also need a D. Where would be a good voice to put a D? The alto? Okay, I'll agree with that. On the altos, move up by step. And what am I not supposed to double? You know, 1/6 chord? The bass. So I'm not going to write another B here, even though it's very tempting. I think what I'll do is I'll just write another D, have the alto and tenor share the D, and then look, the tenor goes DB, and the bass bass does the opposite, B-D. But you see, not only, first of all, I chose a chord that I could based off of the 4 rules, and then I voiced it or I used it in an inversion in such a way that it leads into the given chord smoothly for part writing. Do I have any parallels? No, I don't have any parallel fifths or octaves. Okay, and then finally, let's go ahead and resolve this chord to the 5, 6, 5, and 5. What are my 2 tendency tones here? In the 5, 4, 2 of 2?
G sharp.
Okay, G sharp is 1. And technically, we want to see if that's going to go up. What's the other tendency tone? E, G, B. D is the 7th. So how does the 7th move? Down by step. Okay, now, we got to think about the notes of this chord so we get the right accidentals. A 5 in G is D. A 5 of D is one of these A, C sharp, E, G chords. So what do I have to do to my C? Sharp it. Now, if I just treated it as a triad, I could do this, and everything would be right with the world. But you see, this chord doesn't have a 7th, and it's asking for a 7th chord. Does anyone remember, I probably mentioned it in passing last year, instead of taking the G sharp up as it's supposed to, does anyone remember me saying that secondary T or T can slide down a half step to produce the 7th of the next chord, even when it's in an outer voice? And this is allowed. It's going to slide down a half step because I need a 7th in this chord, and that's the closest place to get it. Okay. So, let's see. Please remember that when a secondary dominant moves to a chord that contains a 7th, that is, this is not just a triad, we sometimes need to make an exception to the rule for T, for secondary T. Instead of taking this pitch up, we slide it down a half step to produce the 7th of the goal chord, or the resolution chord. And this is allowed even when T occurs in an outer voice. But I got to make sure that I use my accidental here, otherwise it'll look and it'll sound funny, because if I don't put the natural on there. Okay. So let me quickly play this, and then we'll be just about done. You get into some really chromatic, but some really nice sounding chord progressions. So we're in the key of G, and it looks like the first chord I have sounds like this, and it goes to this, which then goes to this, which I kind of like. I like that sound. Well, kind of ran out of time, but at least I got through the main part. Your assignment for next time is to do three problems on page, 141 in your workbook. You don't do all of them. Just do 3, kind of just like this. And use the handout I gave you to choose which chord and what inversion you're going to use to come before a secondary dominant. This is in your workbook. And then I think I might have another page with a little bit of analysis on there. But this is the main thing.